Here is the paradox that nobody in the mainstream press wants to say out loud. The most dangerous nuclear facility in the world right now is not a secret weapons site hidden underground. It is a perfectly legal, fully declared, IAEA-monitored civilian power plant. It sits on the Persian Gulf coast. It has been struck 4 times in 5 weeks, and the world has not stopped. This morning, at approximately 8:30 in the morning local time, a projectile hit the perimeter of the Bushehr nuclear power plant in southwestern Iran. 1 person was killed, a security guard whose name we do not yet know. 5 others were wounded. A building on site was damaged by shockwaves and fragments. The IAEA confirmed the strike within hours and reported no increase in radiation levels. Iran's foreign minister went further. He posted on X that his country's nuclear plant has now been struck 4 times. And then he added something that almost every outlet buried in paragraph 11. He warned that radioactive fallout, if it ever came, would not reach Tehran. It would reach the capitals of the Gulf. I have studied the history of how great powers lose control of the crises they start. And what is happening at Bushehr fits a pattern that should make every thinking professional stop and pay attention. I want to be honest with you about what I know and what I do not. I am not a nuclear engineer. I am not a military strategist. What I bring to this table is a disciplined reading of history, economics, and institutional behavior under pressure. I have spent considerable time studying how systems designed to prevent catastrophe begin to fail, not through malice, but through momentum.
And the international architecture around Bushehr is currently under a stress test that it was never designed to survive. Here is my thesis for this video. The strikes near Bushehr are not just a military story. They are a stress test for every contract, every alliance, every deterrence mechanism that the international community built over 50 years to keep civilian nuclear infrastructure out of the line of fire. And the secondary actors in this story, Russia, China, the Gulf states, are the ones who will determine whether that architecture holds or shatters. Let me start where this story actually begins. Not in 2026, not even in 2015 when the JCPOA was signed. Bushehr's story starts in 1975. The Shah of Iran had a vision, a national electrical grid powered by nuclear energy, with Bushehr as the first plant. He hired Kraftwerk Union, a German joint venture of Siemens and AEG Telefunken, under a contract worth between $4 and $6 billion. By 1977, roughly 5,500 Germans were living at the construction site, including their families, a school, a hospital, their own television studio. This was, by any measure, the largest German construction project abroad in history. Then came 1979. The Islamic Revolution ended the contract overnight. The half-built reactor sat in the Persian Gulf humidity for 16 years. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iraqi aircraft bombed the site repeatedly. By the time the dust settled, Bushehr was a symbol of interrupted ambition, and that is when Russia entered. In 1995, Moscow and Tehran signed an agreement for Rosatom to complete the plant. The work took another 16 years, delayed by Western political pressure, technical challenges, and financing disputes. Bushehr finally connected to the Iranian national grid in 2011. It produces roughly 1,000 megawatts of electricity. It serves a city of 250,000 people. It is, by every legal definition that international law recognizes, a civilian facility. The war that brought us here began on February 28, 2026. U.S. and Israeli strikes against Iranian infrastructure began that day, targeting enrichment sites, military installations, and what officials described as dual-use industrial infrastructure. Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, Iraq, the sites that had been at the center of nuclear negotiations for 2 decades, were all struck in the early phases. According to the IAEA, those strikes did not produce significant environmental consequences, partly because the most sensitive equipment at those sites is buried deep underground. Bushehr is different. It is not underground. It sits 17 kilometers southeast of the city of Bushehr, between two fishing villages on the shore of the Persian Gulf. And unlike the enrichment sites, it contains something that the others do not: active nuclear fuel. According to Rosatom CEO Alexei Likhachev, the plant currently houses 72 metric tons of nuclear fuel and 210 metric tons of spent fuel. 210 metric tons of material that, if dispersed, does not simply go away. The 4 strikes near Bushehr follow a disturbing pattern of escalating proximity. The first reported incident was February 28th, the opening day of the war, a strike near the city itself, just a few hundred meters from the plant. Then March 17th, the IAEA confirmed that a projectile struck the premises of the plant. Satellite imagery acquired by Airbus and analyzed by the Institute for Science and International Security showed an impact crater 350 meters from the reactor. A structure was destroyed. No one was hurt that time. March 24th brought another strike on the premises at 9:08 in the evening. And today, April 4th, a projectile hit, killing 1, damaging a building with shockwaves. 4 times in 35 days. The IAEA has been consistent in its messaging: no damage to the reactor, no radiation increase. But IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi has also been consistent in something else. He has warned each time that nuclear plant sites and their nearby areas must never be attacked. He has specifically noted that auxiliary site buildings, the buildings that are being damaged, may contain vital safety equipment. The gap between a building that houses non-critical equipment and a building that houses emergency cooling systems or backup power can be invisible from the outside. And here is where the story of secondary actors becomes essential. Russia built Bushehr. Russia owns the intellectual property on the reactor design. Russia's specialists have been the ones keeping it running. When the war started, Rosatom began evacuating its personnel on day 1. Over 400 Russian nationals were evacuated in stages through Armenia. As of this week, Rosatom announced a final evacuation. Around 200 more people are leaving. What remains, by the company's own account, is a group of up to 50 volunteers, people who agreed to stay and maintain the basic operability of the plant and the construction camp. Think about what that means in operational terms. Bushehr was running on a staff of roughly 3,000 specialists, 700 of them Russian. It is now down to a skeleton crew of volunteers. Construction on Units 2 and 3, which were supposed to be completed this year, is completely suspended. The institutional knowledge walking out the door with each evacuation flight is not easily replaced. And Russia, the country that built this plant, that trained its operators, that supplies its fuel, has been put in an impossible position. Moscow cannot publicly defend Iran without fracturing its careful diplomatic posture. It cannot condemn the strikes without acknowledging the war it has refused to formally recognize. Rosatom CEO Likhachev has tried to thread this needle by speaking in technical terms. The threat is growing. Explosions can be heard kilometers from the plant. Construction is halted. People will be kept safe. What he has not said is what Russia will do if the reactor itself is struck. China is the second secondary actor that almost no one is discussing adequately. Beijing is Iran's largest trading partner. China has been purchasing Iranian oil at discounted prices throughout the sanctions period. The Bushehr plant produces electricity for domestic consumption, which frees up Iranian oil for export, oil that flows, in significant quantities, to Chinese refineries. A disruption at Bushehr is not just an Iranian electricity problem. It is a Chinese energy supply chain problem. But Beijing's stake goes deeper than commodity flows. China has positioned itself over the past decade as the alternative to Western-led international institutions. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the push for non-dollar settlement mechanisms, all of this depends on a credible argument that China offers a stable framework for international engagement. A nuclear incident in the Persian Gulf caused by a conflict that China failed to prevent or contain is the single scenario most likely to undermine that argument. Beijing has every incentive to prevent this from escalating. What it has demonstrated is a preference for statements over actions. The third secondary actor is the one sitting closest to the blast radius, literally. The Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman are within the potential fallout zone of any radiological incident at Bushehr. Iran's foreign minister spelled it out explicitly this morning. Radioactive fallout would not reach Tehran. The prevailing winds in the Persian Gulf region during spring and early summer run northwest to southeast. Bushehr sits on the southwestern coast of Iran. The capitals of the Gulf states are directly downwind. Saudi Arabia finds itself in an extraordinary strategic contradiction. It has long-standing adversarial relationships with Iran and has, in various configurations, supported pressure campaigns against Tehran for decades. But the scenario it fears most, a radiological event in the Persian Gulf, is now measurably closer than it was 5 weeks ago. The Gulf states have been publicly quiet. Privately, according to regional analysts, there is considerable alarm. The economic consequences alone, disruption to desalination plants, contamination of fisheries, the psychological effect on Gulf tourism and finance would be catastrophic for economies built on the premise of stability. Every major actor in this story faces a version of the same impossible choice. The United States and Israel must weigh the military objectives of strikes against Iranian industrial infrastructure against the risk that proximity errors near Bushehr eventually produce the incident they are trying to prevent. Option 1. They establish an explicit exclusion radius around Bushehr and communicate it through back channels. The political cost is giving Iran a sanctuary zone that could be exploited. Option 2. They continue current operations and rely on IAEA monitoring to confirm no reactor damage. The cost is that confidence in that monitoring depends on the 50 volunteers still on site and on communications infrastructure that Rosatom's CEO has already noted is partially disrupted. Russia must choose between maintaining its technical presence at Bushehr, which gives it influence and information, and completing the evacuation, which protects its personnel but leaves the plant in a status of institutional ambiguity that no one designed for. Iran must decide whether to keep the plant operational with a skeleton crew or announce a controlled shutdown that removes the immediate radiological risk but hands its adversaries a significant symbolic and practical victory. And the IAEA must determine how long it can sustain its safety assurances when its ability to verify conditions on the ground is increasingly dependent on Iranian self-reporting. Let me give you 4 scenarios, framed not as predictions, but as the range of outcomes that institutional analysts are actually modeling right now. The first scenario is controlled containment. Diplomatic backchannels, likely running through Moscow, given Russia's unique position as the plant's builder and operator, produce an informal agreement that Bushehr is off the operational targeting list. The war continues elsewhere. The plant limps through on its skeleton crew. This is the best plausible outcome. It requires Russia to act as a genuine intermediary, and it requires the United States and Israel to accept that constraint. Neither condition is guaranteed. The second scenario is a radiological near-miss. A strike damages auxiliary infrastructure sufficiently to interrupt cooling water circulation or backup power to safety systems. No reactor breach, but a situation requiring emergency protocols that cannot be fully executed with 50 volunteers on site. The IAEA declares a Level 2 or Level 3 event. Global energy markets respond immediately. Gulf states issue emergency statements. This scenario produces enormous pressure for a ceasefire without producing the catastrophic outcome. But the pressure itself becomes destabilizing. The third scenario is extended paralysis. The plant shuts down, either deliberately or as the last Russian volunteers leave, but the spent fuel remains on site with minimal supervision. This is not an explosion. It is a slow institutional failure. 210 metric tons of spent fuel requires active cooling for years. A facility that stops being actively managed is a facility that accumulates risk on a timeline measured in months, not seconds. The fourth scenario is the one that justifies every alarm bell: a direct strike on the reactor building or the spent fuel storage. The IAEA's own 7 pillars of nuclear safety — off-site power, cooling systems, communication, emergency response, radiation monitoring, physical protection, staffing — would be simultaneously compromised. The foreign minister's warning about GCC capitals would move from political rhetoric to operational meteorology. If you are watching this as someone who thinks professionally about risk, whether in finance, logistics, energy, or policy, here is what I want you to take away. The contracts that structure the international order around civilian nuclear infrastructure were written in a world where this specific scenario was considered too destabilizing for any rational actor to allow. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the IAEA safeguard system, the informal norms around nuclear facilities in conflict zones — all of these rest on the assumption that the catastrophic downside of a radiological incident creates a natural deterrent. What we are watching at Bushehr is a test of whether that deterrent still functions when the parties to a conflict have already accepted significant escalation costs elsewhere. I am not telling you to panic. Panic is not an analytical response. What I am telling you is that the historical moments that reshaped international frameworks, the ones we now teach in universities as turning points, rarely announced themselves clearly in advance. They looked from inside, like a series of manageable tactical decisions, each of which seemed rational in isolation, until the moment when the accumulated weight of those decisions produced a consequence that no individual decision-maker had fully authorized. That is where we are this morning. 4 strikes, 1 dead, 50 volunteers, 210 metric tons of spent fuel, and the world has not stopped. Let me bring this back to where we started. The paradox is that Bushehr is the most visible, most monitored, most internationally embedded nuclear facility in this conflict, and that visibility has not protected it. The IAEA is watching. Rosatom is evacuating. Russia is threading a diplomatic needle. China is calculating. The Gulf states are quietly alarmed, and the strikes keep coming. What we are witnessing is not simply a military campaign against Iranian infrastructure. We are watching the stress test of a 50-year-old international architecture. Whether that architecture holds, whether the contracts, the norms, the back-channel deterrents that kept civilian nuclear plants out of war zones since the dawn of the atomic age, that question is being answered right now, not in a treaty conference room in Vienna, but on the shore of the Persian Gulf, 350 meters at a time. I have studied enough history to know that the moments when old frameworks break are also the moments when new ones get built, usually at great cost, usually after the damage has been done, and usually by people who were watching closely enough to understand what had just changed. I want you to be one of those people. Here is the question I want to leave you with. If the international norm against striking civilian nuclear facilities cannot hold in this conflict, even with IAEA monitoring, even with Rosatom personnel on site, even with the Gulf states at risk, what exactly is the architecture that replaces it? Think about that. And if you have an answer or a perspective I have not considered, put it in the comments. That is the conversation I want to have.